Welcome, everybody. My name is Kjetil Storsletten. I am the director of the Heller Hurwitz Economics Institute here at University of Minnesota. The purpose of the Heller Hurwitz Economic Institute is to build a bridge between leading-edge economic research happening here on campus and the business leaders, the policymakers, government officials, community members who can benefit from that research. We fulfill that mission through events like this roundtable, through strategic communications, including our office hours podcast, which, by the way, you should listen to, and by studying rigorous research done at done by top University of Minnesota economists and students, all with the goal of influencing real-world economic policy decisions that promote the public good. Tonight, we'll discuss a classical theme in economics, political science, and philosophy: the battle between capital and labor. Nothing less. So most people agree that monopolies are bad for society. And indeed, the government wields its huge powers for using antitrust regulation to mitigate firms' market power in product markets. All right? But what about the market for labor or workers? Should we limit the firm's ability? Should we limit firms' market power as buyers, say in a one-company town, to keep the power they use to keep wages low? And if so, how should that be done? Tonight, we've gathered the leading experts on this topic, and I like to repeat that, the leading experts on that topic. Let me introduce to you the first speaker, Eric Posner. Eric is a Kirkland and Ellis Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. From 2022 to 23, he was counsel to the Assistant Attorney General of the Antitrust Division in the Department of Justice. His academic work is highly influential, and he has written extensively on antitrust and firms' market power over workers. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the American Law Institute. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. And it's great to be here. This is, let me just jump in with a, let's see, with a little, I want to tell you a little bit about a kind of a scandal that occurred almost 15 years ago. These are two famous people. That's Steve Jobs on the right and Eric Schmidt, the head of Google, on the left. And in 2010, the Justice Department got wind of what's called a no-poach agreement between not just Apple and Google, but also Pixar, Adobe, and many other of the big Silicon Valley tech firms. Now, no-poach agreement is an agreement among employers not to hire away one another's workers. This no-poach agreement focused on software engineers. And I don't know how well you can read that. I'll just read to you this email chain. This is an exhibit that the Justice Department produced. It's evidence. So the lower email message, the earlier one, is from Steve. And it says, Eric, I am told that Google's new cell phone software group is relentlessly recruiting in our iPod group. If this is indeed true, can you put a stop to it? Thanks, Steve. And then Eric writes back, I'm sorry to hear this. We have a policy of no recruiting of Apple employees. I will investigate immediately, exclamation point. Eric, okay. So this email exchange clearly reflected some kind of prior agreement not to hire away these software engineers. Now, the Justice Department brought this lawsuit. All of these companies settled immediately, and then they were subsequently sued by the software engineers, who recovered damages of $400 to $500 million in a settlement. And this was, I think, the turning point in antitrust view, or antitrust enforcers' view of the risks of anti-competitive behavior in labor markets. So let me start with a little bit of background about what antitrust law is. Antitrust law is a bunch of statutes. The first antitrust statute, the Sherman Act from 1890, is the most familiar, named after John Sherman, a senator at the time. And the two most important sections of the Sherman Act are Section 1 and 2. Section 1 prohibits restraints of trade, and Section 1 is typically used against cartels. So a famous example is you have a bunch of firms that manufacture vitamins. They agree among themselves on the price rather than competing, and sell that into the output or product market. So regular customers or intermediary firms buy these vitamins, and since the price is elevated, they're harmed by this higher price. And because prices are so high, there are going to be people who are priced out of the market. They don't have access to the vitamins at all. That's a serious violation of the antitrust laws. In fact, it's a criminal violation of the antitrust laws, and the executives can be sent to jail. Section 2 prohibits monopolization. So a famous example right now is the Justice Department's case against Google. The Justice Department argues that Google has monopolized what they call general search services. Now, I think most people except Google acknowledge that Google does have a monopoly in search. It's not illegal to have a monopoly if you obtain it through innovation, but if you either obtain it or maintain it using anti-competitive types of action, different from innovation, that too is illegal. And then there's this Section 7 of the Clayton Act, which was enacted 24 years later, which is going to be the focus of my remarks. And the Clayton Act prohibits mergers that substantially lessen competition. That's language from the statute. So you can imagine if two hospitals merge, let's say two hospitals in Minneapolis merge, if as a result of hospitals are actually not a great example because of all the regulation, but imagine, let's say the two manufacturers in Minneapolis merge. As a result of the merger, they no longer compete between each other for customers, so prices could go up as a result. If that happens, that merger is illegal. And as my examples illustrate, the tradition in antitrust law is to worry just about product markets, output markets. That is, when sellers either obtain monopolies or merge or enter restraints of trade, resulting in higher prices for consumers. And so for a very long time, the focus in antitrust law was on these types of activities. Okay. So in the case of a merger between hospitals, we would traditionally be worried about the impact on patients, the customers, not the impact on the workers. Now, so this begins to change with this no poach scandal involving the Silicon Valley companies. And I just want to introduce a term here for those of you who don't have a background in economics, which is monopsony. So monopsony is the mirror image of monopoly. Monopoly means you have a single firm, let's say firm one over there. You could imagine, let's say that's Walmart. Walmart could have a monopoly, let's say in a small town. If there are no other retailers, it's the only retailer. And if it has a monopoly, it can raise prices because beyond its costs, because it doesn't have to worry about losing customers to competitors. By definition, there are no competitors when you have a monopolist seller. Monopsony refers to the upstream. And so sometimes people say that Walmart has a monopsony with respect to its suppliers because there may be only, so some companies basically sell only to Walmart. But my focus is labor monopsony. So imagine again that there are no other employers in this town. Walmart is the only employer, or maybe there's some really tiny employers like fast food restaurants or something like that. Now we would say, going upstream, if you want a job and you want to stay in this town, you either work for Walmart or no one. You can move away. Then we would say that Walmart has a monopsony, which is basically just a monopoly in the direction of the workers, where they buy labor, rather than consumers, where they sell goods. For quite a long time, there was an assumption in economics that labor monopsony was not much of an issue. It was not important. economists assumed that labor markets were competitive, which, in part means there are lots of employers. So if you imagine a big city like Minneapolis or Chicago or New York, and you're looking for a job, and let's suppose you don't have any particular skills, there are probably a lot of employers that you could find to hire you. Maybe you could work as a security guard for a building, or you could work in a Wendy's, or you could, work as an Uber driver. Lots of employers trying to hire you. The market for your labor is relatively competitive. And so in discussions that you sometimes saw in economics textbooks, people would give illustrations of the occasional market that was characterized by monopsony. So one example is in the 19th century, you would have like mines opened up in remote areas and workers would settle around them. They would be the only employers. They had a monopsony. All right, but the textbooks would say, well, that's not true anymore. There's just not that many remote employers. Another example, my favorite example from a well-known industrial organization textbook, they talk about labor monopsony. The authors talk about labor monopsony. Then they said, but don't worry about it. Markets are competitive. Labor markets are competitive. But then they have one of those boxes. And the example in the box is the Catholic Church. Because if you're a priest, you have only one possible employer, the Catholic Church. So a number of years ago, economists began focusing more on this issue, and they discovered pretty quickly that, in fact, many labor markets are monopsonies. There are very few employers. And so this map is an illustration taken from one of the papers, this one by Azar and co-authors. And the red shows highly concentrated labor markets, orange, slightly less concentrated, and then yellow, and then green is the most competitive labor markets. And as you can see, huge swaths of the United States are characterized by concentrated labor markets, meaning either one or two employers competing. So you could imagine, for example, the small town with a Walmart and a few fast food franchises, or a small town with, let's say, a chicken processing plant, or a small town with, it's mainly surrounded by farms, but also has some kind of manufacturing facility. The only places that have competitive markets, they tend to be highly populated areas like cities, and a few other places as well. Now, most people are in the highly competitive markets because most people live in cities. But tens of millions of people live in these markets where there's only one or two or possibly three major employers. And this is a problem in economics from an economic perspective, because if you have only few employers, then a worker for any one of those employers doesn't have a credible exit option if the employer pays a low wage. So the employer might lower the wage or not raise it to keep it up with prices, or the employer might degrade working conditions. For example, hospitals will sometimes increase the number of beds that a nurse has to monitor. And if you're a nurse in one of these hospitals and there are other hospitals that compete for your labor, you can say to your boss, look, you better pay me more or improve my working conditions or I'll leave. And if the boss doesn't, you just leave and you get better terms at another hospital. But if all of the hospitals merge into one hospital and you're working at that one hospital, you've lost this option. And now you're weak. You don't have any bargaining power relative to the employer. The employer can push down wages. And that's harmful not only to the worker who's affected, but to people more broadly, because if wages are being pushed down below the market rate or the competitive rate, some people will just drop out of the labor market. They won't work, they might retire early, they might move away. And that means that there's less output, less medical care will be produced, which will harm other people in the community. So in this research shows not only that a huge number of labor markets are highly concentrated, but that wages are lower in those markets, as one would expect. And some of the research shows that output is lower, prices are higher, and so forth. I'm not going to, try to explain what these graphs mean. I just want you to understand the basic logic of monopoly and monopsony. It's really the same. So in a competitive market, if you have a seller who tries to charge a price that's above the seller's costs, then the problem that the seller faces is that a consumer will just go to another seller and say, look, this guy's offer is going to charge me a lot. If you charge me a little less, I'll buy from you. And the other seller will say, okay, I'm still making a profit. And so if you have a lot of sellers, the price is bargained down to cost, right? If all of those sellers merge into a single firm and there's just one firm, that seller will charge a much higher price. Now, that doesn't mean the price will be infinitely high, because what the seller is still worried about is, as it raises the price, some people might just drop out of the market completely. So the seller is going to choose a price that's above the competitive price, but will still reflect basically the demand of consumers, the willingness of consumers to pay a high price. So the labor market trade-off is very similar. In a competitive labor market, if an employer tries to pay, a low wage to people, they'll just say, well, I'm going to quit and go and work for your competitor. And so wages will be bid up to what's called the marginal revenue product, basically the value that the employee gives to the employer. But if all of the employers merge into one company, there's no longer this exit option or bidding process. And so wages will be suppressed, resulting in less output. So from an economics perspective and a general antitrust perspective, monopoly and monopsony are mirror images of each other. They both cause the same kind of harm. Now, this is a puzzle because in the whole history of antitrust law going back to the 1890s, there have been hardly any antitrust cases against employers. And so this graph shows the three sections of antitrust law, which I told you about before, Section 1, Section 2 of the Sherman Act, and Section 7 of the Clayton Act. And the blue bar is the number of antitrust cases over the last 3 years that involve product markets, that is where consumers are hurt. And the orange bar is our labor market cases. And as you can see, there are far fewer labor market cases than product market cases. Now, this is actually beginning to change, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But if you go back farther, if you go back 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, the orange bars would basically be zero, close to zero. There are some labor market cases, but very few. Now, let me tell you about some of these legal developments in connection with mergers. Okay, so the two agencies that are empowered to review and block mergers are the Department of Justice and the FTC. And they've set up these guidelines that they publicize. And these guidelines basically tell firms, these are the types of mergers that we'll try to block, and these are the types of mergers that we'll allow to go through. Now, remember, the statute says that a merger is illegal if it substantially lessens competition. That phrase is a little bit ambiguous. So the purpose of these guidelines is to provide a little bit of clarity about what this would mean in practice. And I'll tell you a bit more about them in a moment. The important thing is that historically, the guidelines never mentioned labor. And then after this 2010 Silicon Valley scandal, the DOJ and the FTC wake up to the possibility that firms as employers are engaging in anti-competitive behavior in labor markets. And they issue this human resources guidance in 2016, where they say to Steve and Eric, look, if you guys do this again, we will prosecute you and put you in jail. And more broadly, we're putting all firms on notice not to engage in no poaching agreements and wage fixing agreements and other types of anti-competitive behavior in labor markets. If you do, we will go after you. Shortly after that, the FTC intervened in this hospital merger in Texas. And this is the first time, as far as I'm aware, that either of the agencies have actually explicitly said the problem with this merger is that it's going to concentrate labor markets, in this case, the labor markets for registered nurses, too much. So it should not be allowed. Subsequently, the DOJ challenged a merger between the two of the biggest publishing companies, Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster. Now, in a traditional merger between publishers, the DOJ would be focused on the price effect of a merger. So the worry would be if two big publishers merge, then they'll raise the price for books, and that'll cause harm to readers. People will have to pay more for their books. Some people won't be able to afford them. That's a social harm that we want to prevent. But for the first time in a litigated merger, the DOJ says, no, the problem here is that this will reduce the compensation for authors. Because when authors are selling their manuscripts, they basically auction them off to publishers. And if there are fewer publishers bidding for their manuscripts, their compensation will be lower. In 2023, the DOJ and the FTC revised the merger guidelines, and they finally added a section that explicitly said that we will evaluate mergers based in part on their impact on labor markets. And just recently, the FTC challenged two more mergers, the Kroger-Albertsons and Tapestry-Capri mergers, based in part on their impacts on labor markets. So what does this mean? How do the agencies do merger analysis in labor markets? It's actually, very simple in a way. First of all, the government, the FTC or the DOJ has to make a prima facie case. So they have to come to the court with a plausible theory about why this merger will be harmful. And traditionally, that means you have two big firms with large shares of the market, and if they combine, they're going to have an enormous share of the market. This is formalized a little bit, as I'll explain. And if their new market share is big enough, we will presumptively argue that this merger substantially lessens competition. So if you have two lemonade stands merging, and there are dozens of them, we're not worried because each lemonade stand has a tiny part of the market. And if they merge, they'll remain small relative to all the other lemonade stands. But if we have two enormous firms merging, Kroger and Albertsons, each of them actually have a large share of a market, of various local markets. And so we will try to block it. And then the defendants, the merging companies, have the opportunity to argue in response. Actually, the merger is going to help consumers traditionally or workers. So even though the market will become much more concentrated, in the traditional argument, prices are going to go down. Now, if agencies are evaluating a merger based on its impact on labor markets, then the argument has got to be that the merger is going to cause wages to increase. Now, in order to engage in this kind of analysis, the government has to start by defining what the market is. So in a traditional merger, let's say between two grocery stores, when you're focusing on the consumer, the market would be groceries. The sale of groceries in a particular area where people live and go to the grocery stores to buy them. When you're looking at the labor market, you're looking at the workers and what they do. So the question would be, what impact does the merger have on grocery store workers? And there could be different kinds of grocery store workers. And then there are these tests, which I'll tell you about shortly. Just very quickly, labor market definition involves, first of all, figuring out what the geographic scope of the labor market is. So that's how far people are willing to commute. So you could imagine maybe people are willing to commute throughout the Minneapolis metropolitan area, or maybe just within the city limits, or maybe even less than that. And then you have to define the occupation type. So every type of job is a different market. Accounting is one market. Legal services is another market. Grocery services is another market. So in this hypothetical example, I've got 3 factories. And if you imagine that these factories all draw workers from a particular community living in those little houses, the first thing you're going to ask is, well, what's their share of the market? And so I've just hypothetically said 2 firms have a 30% share of the market, and the third has a 40% share. And for the government to make its prima facie case, it's just going to say, basically, in the old days, it would just say, look, we're going from a market with 3 firms, which with roughly a third of the market, to one firm that has, 2 firms, one with 60%, one with 40%. That's a hugely concentrated market. There's not much competition, and the reduction in competition is substantial. Nowadays, the agencies use the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which is just the sum of market shares squared. So in this example, so Herfindahl-Hirschman goes from 0, which is an infinite number of firms, to 10,000, which is just a single firm. And this, in this example, the HHI would increase from 3,400 to 5,200. And then the merger guidelines have thresholds. So basically, the threshold now is if a merger results in a post-merger HHI above 1,800, and the HHI increases by 100, it's presumptively illegal. So this merger would be presumptively illegal. This type of analysis is very challenging. You have to define the occupation in order to figure out what the market share is. In the case of the Penguin Random House merger, the government defined the occupation as, you have to define the occupation to determine what the market share is. In the Penguin Random House case, the occupation was basically you're an author, but you have to be a good author. So an author who can make or like a really good author who can make $250,000 in an advance. In the Texas hospitals case, the relevant occupation was defined as registered nurses. Kroger Albertsons, it was unionized grocery workers, and in Tapestry Capri, the occupation was defined quite vaguely as just retail employees. These 2 companies own luxury brands, which they sell from retail stores around the world. This occupation definition process is extremely complicated because what you're really looking at is whether the particular person with certain skills would regard different jobs as the same. So lots of hospitals actually will subdivide, or all hospitals will subdivide their nurses into different types of nurses. There are nurses who are specialized in geriatric care and nurses who are specialized in oncology, and they're not necessarily, they're not engaging in identical tasks. So there's always going to be a battle in these cases over the proper way to define an occupation. The geographic definition of market is similarly complicated. In Penguin Random House, they used the whole nation. In the Texas hospital cases, it was this commuting area. Kroger Albertsons, it was several miles around a store, and in Tapestry and Capri, it was left unclear. This is a map that I found on the web, produced by some firm called Maptitude. And it shows the Kroger Albertsons market overlap. So basically, these are just purple dots. These are all the communities in the country where Kroger and Albertsons both have stores. And so presumably in those areas, they're drawing from the same labor market of grocery store workers. And so in those areas, the merger will result in less labor market competition. And that's a concern for the FTC, which has brought this case. Okay, so what should the market share threshold be? I told you before that in the 2023 merger guidelines, you've got this 1,800 number. That basically means that we're going to block a merger if you have 6 competing firms becoming 5 or 5 becoming 4, somewhere around that range. Whereas in the earlier version of the merger guidelines, it was more like 4 to 3. And so these new guidelines are stricter, and based on this concern that that there's been too many mergers in this country, and that's part of what has contributed to higher prices, lower wages, and maybe less mobility and so forth. But Kyle's going to talk more about this issue, so I will move on. This is from the Texas case, and it shows that these 2 hospitals, Shannon and SACMC, before the merger, Shannon had 57% of the market of registered nurses, and this other hospital had 39%. So when they merge, they have 96% of the market of registered nurses. So if you're a nurse before the merger and you're working at Shannon and your boss says, we're lowering your wage, you can say, well, I'm leaving, I'm going to go work for this other hospital. After the merger, that becomes impossible, right? That's the basic problem. In the Penguin Random House case, Penguin Random House had 37% of the market. Simon & Schuster had 12%. This is a little subtler here. They go from 37-12 to having 49% of the market. If you use the HHI measure, you're going up from 2,100 to 3,000. So the post-merger HHI is very high, and the change is very high as well. So the Justice Department won this case in part because of the sort of prima facie harm being caused. There's a lot of interesting discussion in this case, which I'm going to skip because of the time, but looking at precisely how these auctions take place and the impact that they have on the compensation. And what this, for example, shows that if the merger were to take place, then the compensation of various kinds of authors would decline by 4 to 19%. In all of these cases, the employer can come back and say, look, this merger is efficient. It's going to make us more productive and result in, and in the traditional argument is it'll result in lower prices. In the case of these labor market side mergers, the concern is that the merger is going to suppress wages. So what the employers now have to say when they merge is that the merger will actually increase wages and make people better off. And I want to just conclude with a few questions. These questions are questions that I'm thinking about and working on, and other people are also working on. These are questions that the FTC and the DOJ are asking themselves. So one question is, so there are thousands of mergers occur every year. Only a small fraction of them are challenged because the agencies have limited resources. We don't really know how much these mergers harm labor markets. There's a lot of work being done that suggests that they're causing substantial harm, but there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. One of the tricky questions is that these mergers might not actually reduce wages, but they can result in degradation of job conditions. And this is a frequent complaint, especially after hospital mergers. So doctors and nurses will often complain after a hospital merger that while their wages or compensation haven't gone down, the job has become a lot more difficult. They're given less autonomy. They're required to see more patients and spend less time with each patient. So that needs to be measured. Second question is, the system that we're using to evaluate labor markets is the system that was developed to evaluate labor markets was not designed, for product markets, was not designed for labor markets. And there's this question about whether it's appropriate, both the methods and these HHI numbers that are used will work for labor markets. Well, labor markets are different from product markets in many ways. So for example, in a product market, most product markets, it's very easy to switch from one product to another if the price goes up or the quality goes down. Whereas with labor markets, it's much harder for people to switch jobs. And one of the reasons why it's hard to switch jobs is that jobs are all very different. Employers are different. How much you like or dislike your job might be a function of where the office is located, what your colleagues are like, and this all differs across jobs. So these things, which economists call frictions, can make it much harder to analyze labor market effects. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kyle, who's going to, or I guess you're going to introduce Kyle. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over for the introduction of Kyle, who will talk in more detail about some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me introduce the second speaker, my colleague, Kyle Herkenhoff. He's an associate professor of economics at the University of Minnesota and a consultant at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Kyle is a rising star in economics, and his work is having substantial influence in labor economics and macro. Notably, Kyle and his team, some of them being in this room, have made major contributions to our understanding of employers' market power over workers. Okay, take it away.
Great. Great to be here. So this is joint work with David Berger at Duke University. Thomas Hazenzagel, who's a graduate student here, will be on the market next year doing excellent work, and take a look at him. Simon Monge, who's in the audience and is at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and Eric Posner, who just gave the talk. So in the last 5 years, there's really been a plethora of academic research arguing that monopsony is present in many industries across many countries and present for blue collar and white collar workers alike. So our research has been part of this explosion of studies. And the general theme in these studies is to look at responses of wage and employment after discrete changes in productivity at a firm, so induced by taxes or innovation, and to look at how wages and employment respond in markets where that firm is a large player in the labor market, and in markets where that same firm is a small player in the labor market. Across those studies, each of them has concluded that workers take home about 70% of what a competitive wage would dictate. Despite this large monopsony markdown, existing optimal policy exercises have really been constrained to two tools. The first of which is minimum wages, that we're going to probably talk about in the panel, that we've argued are fairly ineffective at stemming monopsony power, and it's like trying to turn off a light switch with a sledgehammer. The tax systems as well have been used to study optimal policy for monopsony, but those tax systems really have to weigh many other objectives, primarily redistributive objectives. And I think it's unlikely that monopsony would be first order in revisions of those policies. So what we're going to do today, the theme of this conference, is talk about antitrust policy applied to the labor market. So the merger guidelines are really built around this idea of the structural presumption. So I'm just going to quote the first guideline in the 2023 merger guidelines, which is that mergers raise a presumption of illegality when they significantly increase concentration in a highly concentrated market. This structural presumption is built around the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, as Eric introduced, and the HHI is just 10,000 times the summation of the market shares of the players in the market squared. And in 2023 and in 1982, we were in what I'm going to call strict regimes. So the structural presumption of anti-competitive effects kicked in if that Herfindahl exceeded 1800 after the merger, and the change in Herfindahl induced by the merger was greater than 100. The 2010 guidelines are what I'm going to call the loose regime, and those 2010 guidelines effectively encoded the current practices at the time of the DOJ and FTC, which is to prosecute the most egregious cases. And there, the anti-competitive effects were presumed to occur when the Herfindahl post-merger exceeded 2,500 and the change in Herfindahl exceeded 200. So Eric said, we took 6 firms with equal market shares. Before the merger, the Herfindahl would be 1,700, and if 2 of those firms emerge, any 2 of those firms emerge, the new Herfindahl, HHI prime, would be about 2,200. Change in Herfindahl there would be 500. That would be caught under these 2023 guidelines, but would have been let through under the 2010 guidelines. Now, as Eric mentioned in his talk, these thresholds were developed for and almost exclusively applied to product markets. So what we're going to do today is ask and measure worker welfare, or we're going to call worker harm, when alternate guidelines for the labor market are adopted. So what's our approach? So I'm not going to go into the details in this talk. We're going to talk about the model at a high level, but we're going to develop a new framework where large strategic firms merge. And this is going to be based off of our work in the American Economic Review in 2022. And we're going to use the model to theoretically characterize what happens after mergers to wages and employment. We're going to estimate the model in US Census data and then show that it replicates post-merger outcomes that have been documented in other studies that also use confidential US Census data, namely the paper by David Arnold. So what do we find? So if mergers result in the standard ad hoc 5% efficiency gain, we find that applying stricter 2023 or the old 1982 regime of guidelines actually makes workers better off amongst permitted mergers. Applying looser 2010 guidelines actually harms workers. They're worse off even amongst the mergers that are allowed. And basically the idea there is under the 2010 guidelines, many mergers generate substantial increase in monopsony power that's simply not offset by the efficiency gains. There's people in this audience, including Jim Schmitz and Tom Holmes, who have argued that this standard 5% efficiency gain is perhaps far too generous. This number should be negative, in which case both of the guidelines are in fact not strict enough. So there's going to be two key modeling assumptions that go into our exercise, and I'm going to motivate them based on the 2023 merger guidelines. So first of which is we're going to focus on worker welfare. I'm going to argue that the language in the 2023 guidelines puts worker welfare in the center of the debate. So I'm going to quote here, a merger that reduces competition may lower wages or slow wage growth, worsen benefits, working conditions, or result in other degradations of workplace quality. Importantly, though, the second paragraph says, at the same time, workers may seek not only a paycheck, but also work that they value in a workplace that matches their own preferences, as well as workers, as different workers may value the same aspects of a job differently. So this is on page 27 in Guideline 10, which is the labor market guideline. So you look at this and you think immediately, well, how are we going to distinguish valuations of non-wage amenities versus pay? And you're squarely in the welfare toolbox of economics. The second assumption is that we're going to hold product markets fixed when we assess the impact of mergers on labor markets. So here again, I'm going to quote from that labor market guideline, Guideline 10. If a merger may substantially lessen competition, tend to create a monopoly in upstream markets, that loss of competition is not offset by purported benefits in a separate downstream market. So the upstream market here is the labor market. The downstream market is closer to the consumers, and that's the product market, but we're not going to net the two against each other. If you break the law in one market, it's illegal. So what we're going to do is I have here on the bottom of the slides, assess worker welfare, holding product market competition fixed. And we'll discuss, I believe, in the Q&A, the economic guidance here. So let me go through the model at a high level verbally. The key features in this model are that workers are mobile across many different labor markets, so thousands of different labor markets in the United States. US Census data, unlike other countries like Norway, we've also studied occupations. Here, we're really limited to look at industries rather than occupations, but about, I'd say 90% of cases, industry is an occupation, and it's sort of contrived examples where that's not the case, like janitors and secretaries being prime examples. But for our application, we're going to think of 3-digit industries within a commuting zone. So you could think furniture manufacturing in the Minneapolis commuting zone or electronics manufacturing in the Minneapolis commuting zone. Workers then have preferences over the amenity value of those jobs, okay? So non-wage aspects of the jobs. What this does is, in sort of reduced form, generates what look like switching costs between employers within a market and switching costs of moving across markets, where those switching costs are higher of moving across markets. Here, firms are going to be strategic. They're going to internalize their effect on market aggregates. They're also going to differ in terms of productivity. The strategic component is important. Without the strategic aspects, mergers would have no effect on labor markets. And in order to match the data we see, we need the strategic firms. We're going to nest this model in general equilibrium, which just means price is going to be pinned down by supply and demand, and that's going to allow us to talk about welfare. So we calibrate the model as we did in our AER article based on US Census data. What we do to show that we've written down or developed a reasonable mousetrap is we take this model and we show that it replicates existing evidence by David Arnold on the labor market impacts of mergers. So we don't target these features of the data, and we show that our model does quite well at matching them. So in the first column here is David Arnold's study, and in the second column is our calibrated model. We generate a set of representative mergers so that on average, the size distribution of those mergers matches the data. And what we show is the model is able to reproduce large decline in employment after a merger. So David Arnold estimates in a 4-year window after a merger, almost a 15% loss in employment. We estimate about 9% loss. Wages go down by about 0.8%, and in our model 0.7%. And crucially for antitrust policy, these effects are driven by high concentration markets. So David then splits the data into high concentration, medium concentration markets. The mergers in those high concentration markets lower wages by about 3 percentage points, in our model about 4.4 percentage points. So something like a factor of 3 to 4 greater than in medium concentration markets. So we view this as a reasonably designed model. So let's take this car for a spin. And the first test lap we're going to do is with the Penguin Random House merger. So Eric introduced this merger. Penguin Random House and Simon Schuster were the first and third largest of the big 5 commercial publishers. Penguin Random House had a market share in the high advanced author segment of 37%, and Simon Schuster had a market share of 12%. The merger was proposed in 2020, and the DOJ then sued to block the merger on the grounds of harm to American workers, in this case authors, through consolidation among buyers, referred to as monopsony. And here, in particular, this language of harm really reflects the welfare objective of the courts. So we're going to adopt a similar objective, and in November 2022, Penguin Random House and Simon Schuster actually scrapped the proposed merger. What we're going to do is exactly replicate and match the publishing industry's market shares, and then we're going to simulate the Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster merger and compare this to what the expert computed in the case. So in order to assess whether the merger harms workers or not, what we show theoretically is that workers in our model are unharmed if the market wage remains or exceeds pre-merger levels. So bold-faced WJ is the market level wage. And what we're looking for if workers are unharmed is that bold-faced WJ after the merger is greater than what it was before the merger. What we compute in the Penguin Random House merger case is that a whopping 17% efficiency gain would have been required for these high advanced authors to be unharmed. I'm just going to show this graphically here. On the x-axis is the efficiency gain that we hand to Penguin Random House and Simon Schuster. We assume both firms enjoy this efficiency gain after the merger. On the y-axis here, we're plotting the percent change in the market wage. This blue line here simulates the merger between Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster. So this intercept of minus 5% indicates if there was a 0% efficiency gain, wages in this high advanced author market would fall by about 5%. And now what I want you to do is just trace this up with your eyes visually until this crosses 0. That's the point at which high advanced author wages would have been equivalent pre and post merger. Trace that back down to this x-axis, and you see that you would need something like a 17% efficiency gain for this merger to leave workers unharmed. Again, many in the literature would argue that the efficiency gains post-merger are 0, even negative, in the sense that competition and efficiency gains go hand in hand. So it's unlikely that any merger would have met or exceeded this level. We also simulate mergers between the 2 smallest firms. You would still need something like 14% efficiency gain there to break even. And this green line is the 2 largest of the big 5 publishers. And here you would need sort of extreme efficiency gains of 30% for that merger to leave workers unharmed. So the expert in the case estimated a very similar wage decline at Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster. So we view this model again as being a decent mousetrap for studying mergers. So what we're going to do is then extend this to the US economy and simulate a representative set of mergers and ask who's better and worse off under various merger guidelines. So the way that we do this is we simulate those mergers as we did in the validation exercise to match the US Census's distribution of mergers that David Arnold reports in his paper. And we're going to again assume this 5% ad hoc efficiency gain. And what we're going to do is compute welfare gains and losses in every affected market, and we're going to add it up across the workers in those markets. we find in short is that workers are better off with 2023 guidelines and are harmed under the 2010 guidelines. In this table, what I'm doing is turning those welfare gains and losses into a dollar amount. In the paper, we have this as a share of wages in the market. We also have this in terms of the required efficiency gains for the merger to break even. But for today, I'm going to put this in dollars. So in this first column here is simulating the 2023 guidelines, in which we block mergers for post-merger HHIs that exceed 1,800 and changes in Herfindahl's that exceed 100. In column B, we apply the 2010 guidelines where that threshold is moved up to 2,500 for the Herfindahl and the change in Herfindahl is 200. So here we plot the change in average welfare in that market aggregated across the workers, assuming a 5% efficiency gain. What's important here are the signs rather than the magnitudes, but among permitted mergers, those mergers actually yield welfare gains among workers about $19,000 per market. And in many of these mergers, like in Kroger at Albertsons, you would involve thousands of markets. Blocked mergers, on the other hand, if we had let them through, so the ones that we blocked, if we had let them through, would have yielded worker welfare losses in those markets of to the tune of $800,000. Again, many of those mergers would involve hundreds, if not thousands, of markets. Panel B, we apply the older, looser regime, less strict regime, the 2010 guidelines. And what we find is that even among permitted mergers, workers are worse off because those guidelines only block the most egregious cases. If we let those egregious cases through, it would have been close to $1 million loss in aggregate in each market for each merger. So we've had some discussion, Eric hinted at this, should labor markets be treated differently than product markets? And again, these guidelines were developed, and applied exclusively to product markets for the last century. We find at our estimated levels of monopsony power is that the DOJ and FTC could do a bit better by actually making the guidelines a bit stricter in labor markets relative to product markets. I think just common sense and introspection, as Eric has alluded to, is that it's hard to switch employers relative to many product categories out there. I mean, there's counterexamples there, but I think on average in the labor market, we just say universally harder to switch jobs. Here we find that the welfare gains are significantly larger if we tighten up the thresholds to what was the moderate concentration threshold in the past, which was a Herfindahl of 1,500 and a change in Herfindahl of 100 post-merger. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to the panel. So what we contributed this paper was the first economic analysis of the merger guidelines applied to the labor market. And we showed that the 2023 1982 guidelines left workers unharmed under standard efficiency gains, whereas the 2010 guidelines were too loose and actually harmed workers when applied to labor markets. In the paper, we go through downwards wage pressure formulas, and we talk about their measurement implementation, which is a way of sort of sidestepping the issue of defining the markets. We talk about product market power, but I think the legal interpretation is that those should be held fixed when we consider labor markets. And then we talk as well about labor redundancy via increasing returns, which I think we'll revisit in the panel. So thanks for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Shelley.
Thank you very much for that exciting talk. We are now ready for the fireside chat. We would like to welcome our moderator for this evening, Stacy Slaughter. Slaughter is a heavyweight in antitrust litigation. She's a co-chair and executive board on the executive board of the Antitrust and Trade Regulation Group at Robbins Kaplan LLP. She has decades-long experience in consumer class action litigation, complex commercial litigation, antitrust litigation, and securities and financial markets litigation. The cases Stacy has litigated have recovered more than $6 billion for victims of deceptive and unlawful conduct, and included some of the largest, most high-profile, and most innovative cases affecting financial markets. But just to put things in perspective, $6 billion, that's like $1,200 per person in Minnesota. Stacy? Take it.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's been a fabulous talk. So right now we're just going to, ask some questions, and we'll have some time for audience Q&A. But I thought I'd start with, we've had antitrust laws and the guidelines around for the last century, and so with guideline 10, which is designed to promote competition specifically in labor markets, what prompted this new focus on labor markets and on workers in particular?
Yeah, so it's not entirely clear because this occurred in the minds of agency officials over the years. But my guess is there were two main causes. One was the Silicon Valley no poach agreement case that I talked about. I think that first alerted the agencies to the possibility that there was a serious problem of anti-competitive behavior in labor markets. And then second of all, it was the economic literature. And it's a really actually important example of how research can influence policy. So the fact that there were these dozens of papers being published in the late teens and more recently that showed that labor markets were very concentrated, and in particular that mergers contributed to concentration in a way that harmed workers, that had a big influence, I believe, on the agencies and was a big part of what led them to update the merger guidelines.
Well, the guidelines describe employers as buyers of labor. And so when the agencies are now analyzing a merger between two employers, how will they weigh any competing harm to workers in the upstream markets and with any benefits to purchasing consumers in the downstream markets under the new guideline?
Right. So in antitrust law, there's a tradition of focusing only on one market. So in other words, if a firm, let's say two firms merge and they cause harm in one market, the fact that they don't cause harm in another market, or they may even create benefits in the other market, doesn't rescue the firm. If you cause sufficient harm in a sufficiently important market, the merger is blocked. And this is actually familiar. Take the Kroger and Albertsons case. When you have a pair of chain stores, like so these are grocery stores, both companies own grocery stores all over the country. At least in principle, if the FTC identified just one market, let's say Chicago, where the merger would result in higher grocery prices, then the merger would be blocked, even if in other markets the merger had no impact on grocery prices or even lowered grocery prices. And there are various reasons for this. Part of it might have to do with the fact that firms can divest certain outlets, but basically the reason is just to keep things simple. Now, when you take this logic and apply it to labor markets, it's the same. If a merger causes harm in labor markets, but also benefits a product market, it's blocked. And then analogously, if you had a merger that benefited workers but harmed consumers, it would also be blocked. Now, in terms of, Kyle, you might want to talk about this a little bit. Some economists are kind of unhappy with this very simple legal approach, because you might think that you should approve a merger if the aggregate benefit is positive. I guess one question is whether it's possible to do that in a reliable way.
Yeah, I would argue that the economics of the question is clearly, yes, there should be cross-market balancing. We should consider the product market and the labor market and business owners all in our antitrust analysis. And I think in the past, when it was just a question of product market power, Russell Pittman, who is the director of the antitrust division, has argued that, of course, equity holders are better off. They wouldn't have proposed the merger if it were to harm them. So we could just simply look at consumers and ask, well, are consumers better or worse off? As soon as we have three parties involved in this merger, and we think about workers potentially also being consumers, I think the business owner arguments are still there, that they wouldn't propose this unless they're harmed. But we have to consider together, like in Kroger and Albertsons, the workers themselves might be purchasing the goods at the grocery store themselves. And when we define wages, we typically think in economics of real wages, right? Where we do have to take a stance on the prices that these folks are paying, as well as changes in their wages. I think for us as modelers or economists, it's convenient to keep the product market fixed and not have to worry about modeling the prices. But I really think that the economics of it really do entail analysis of how prices change for the workers.
Well, when we're focusing on the labor market, where would we draw the line? For example, is harm to just one employee enough to prevent a merger? What's the threshold?
Right. So this is well, as you know, often there's just like these fuzzy gray areas. Technically the statute just says a merger that substantially lessens competition is illegal. So what does substantially mean? That's left for both the agencies and the courts to figure out. I think as a practical matter, the answer is when agencies challenge a merger, they go to a court and seek a preliminary injunction. And this brings into play all of these legal doctrines that basically say that when a court is evaluating an application for a preliminary injunction, which means blocking the merger, you do a kind of public interest analysis. So if the merger is only harming one person, a court would say, well, that's not enough to block it. You might let the merger go through and let that person sue for damages. It's probably not going to happen. If it harms a substantial number of people, a market where there are a lot of people and prices are going up or wages are going down, then the court will block it. Where's the line drawn? Hard to say. Part of the reason it's hard to say is that when agencies are selecting which mergers to challenge, the agencies have very limited resources. So they only go after the really big mergers. So as a practical matter, we don't get this question. And so the courts don't have to, address this issue of cases where there's a very small number of people who are affected.
Yeah, I just think from the economic side of this, I mean, introspection would suggest that the answer is no. If it just harms one worker, that we should not block the merger. And I don't think from a statistical sense, there would be any procedure that would ever allow us to make such a conclusion with any accuracy. And I think this is where, when you come to actually implementing these guidelines in the court, you're going to see the economic welfare toolbox show up in the sense of, we need to aggregate and add up across people in order to make these welfare assessments. And I think that's where, we'll see this show up in the courts, where we'll see the standard economic toolbox will be helpful. We're going to have some workers who benefit from added part-time shifts. We'll have some workers who lose. And we need to have some way of comparing welfare outcomes across those workers, aggregating and saying on net if we should allow the merger through or not.
How can we distinguish between layoffs that are due to greater labor market power from layoffs due to labor redundancy? For example, my company has too many in-house lawyers. And we really don't need any because we have perfect antitrust compliance. So how do we get there?
Right. So as a very rough approximation, I'll just talk about the law and then Kyle can talk about, just as a very rough approximation, the distinction is whether the layoffs are the result of greater market power or some kind of reorientation of the business that makes it more productive, for example. And so, this can, at least in theory, be measured directly. If you have two firms that merge into one, creating a monopsony, the general expectation is that they're going to use that power to lower wages a lot, right? So the agencies will go to the court and say, look, you have this 2-to-1 merger. We can probably make an estimate of the impact on wages. That reduction in wages is the result of, which of course will result in less employment because some people will quit when they're not being paid as much. So that's the result of labor market power. On the other hand, the firms are allowed to argue that what we're doing is we're becoming more productive, or we're reorienting our business a little bit. So we don't need, you know, these workers that we used to have. And in fact, your firm, for example, you know, it always can fire people who are redundant, if that's, you know, desirable. That's not illegal. So if you were to merge with another firm and then go ahead and fire the redundant people, that would not be regarded as illegal, as long as it's the result of, you know, true redundancy, which would itself have to be kind of proven and shown, as opposed to the greater market power.
So I mean, I think that it's possible with enough data to distinguish monopsony from labor redundancies. And I think, you know, in the case of, you know, Kroger and Albertson merging, those two companies themselves have been through a series of earlier mergers. And, you know, ideally you would have data on these past mergers. You would look at in markets where they were small in that labor market, they combined, versus markets where they were large and potentially had monopsony power, how their restructuring differed, right? And if you had occupation data, you could make a conclusion even, you know, within accountants, within managers, within clerks, how redundancies squared against monopsony. I think outside of those cases where you have very well-defined histories of mergers where you could potentially measure these, I think the US Census data really is a valuable tool, in that we have an ownership change database that was developed in conjunction with one of my co-authors who's on this paper, Gordon Phillips, where you can look over, you know, the last 4 decades and study mergers across different labor markets. And really, you know, I think that's where, you know, the economics research will help these cases in the future, is coming up with that toolbox to separate the two. And I think with enough data through subpoena, it's possible to do it in a case-by-case basis.
Kyle, you touched on this in your presentation, but why isn't a federal minimum wage adequate enough to address our concern about harm to workers?
So I think it's two-pronged. So I mean, the guidelines were very specific in that lessening of competition would show up in reductions in wages and also reductions in amenities and working conditions, and maybe in changes in shift lengths. And I think that's where the minimum wage in some sense is limited. So you can restrict the wages that they pay, but firms are free to, you know, in essence, undo those restrictions on wages through the non-price components of the job. And just if you look in the academic research on minimum wages, they really only have bite amongst firms that are effectively low profit margin, fairly competitive firms. So if you look in the restaurant industry in Minneapolis, even a very localized minimum wage there. Work by my colleagues, Lucas Karababunis, Jeremy Lice, and Anusha Nath has very convincingly shown that pre-COVID minimum wage hikes led to large reductions in jobs, to the order of something like between 10 and 20% of jobs in restaurants in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so I think what happens is you raise minimum wages and you have this counterintuitive, very intuitive effect, but you have this countervailing force, which is you're pushing out these small competitors. You're reducing competition, and you're putting more market power in the hands of the large chains and retailers who have the ability to pay the higher minimum wage. So I find this you know, very interesting argument. Maybe it's a bit academic. So I have something in the slides that I just wanted to show the audience. Maybe I don't have to get up here and click it. So the Amazon took out ads for a $15 federal minimum wage. And this is an article by Vice, and they're just saying Amazon's lobbying for a $15 minimum wage is a PR boon, a hiring strategy, an anti-union tactic, and a move against competitors all in one. And it was clear that the other firms at the time would announce internal minimum wages in the range of $10 to $12, simply were going to be squeezed more by the $15 minimum wage. And even in retail services, you have this size wage premium where the more productive firms, these larger firms like Amazon, can pay higher wages. And in that sense, you know, they turned this minimum wage into a way of reducing competition.
Let me just also add that the minimum wage, encounters labor market power only of the employers who employ, the people who are paid not very much, right? But the labor monopsony problem is pervasive throughout the economy. So one of the examples I gave was hospital mergers. And the people who are mainly affected by the hospital mergers are nurses and medical professionals who are paid much more than the minimum wage. But we still object to the mergers because if the hospitals gain labor market power, the wage of the nurses will go down, their autonomy will go down, people will drop out of the market. There will be all these kinds of social harms. And the minimum wage can't do anything about that.
And would the same be true for a more localized minimum wage, so a state or city minimum wage?
Well, you would to address the sort of higher wage people who are harmed by increases in labor market power, you'd need a different minimum wage for every type of job. And there are some countries and jurisdictions which do have different minimum wages for different types of jobs. But even that, it's very hard to calculate what the minimum wage should be. This is why we have a market generally for wages and prices. It's just like how do you know? The sort of the most kind of intuitive and sort of historically important response to this problem is really union organization. So if the nurses form a union, then they aggregate their bargaining power and can push back against the employer who's trying to suppress their wages. But the minimum wage law, it doesn't produce that same kind of outcome.
Well, I'm glad you brought up unions because my next question is whether we need to factor in union response when calculating worker harm.
Right. So I think a lot of people think that if two firms, let's say Kroger Albertsons is a good example, a lot of their stores are unionized. So you might think that if Kroger and Albertsons merge, they're not going to be able to suppress wages because the workers are protected by the union. So the union's going to be able to fight back. Now, legally, that's regarded as irrelevant. Basically, it could play a role in analysis, but the basic concern about the law is to prevent increasing concentration. And if, the people who are affected by that, the nurses in this example, are able to resist the impact on their working conditions or wages, we still want to block it because there are all kinds of harms that result from increasing competition. But also, it's important to understand that even if the workers are unionized, when the merger occurs, the employer is going to gain more market power relative to the union. So one would expect that even their unionized wages, the wages that the union is able to bargain for, are going to be pushed down. And the logic is very similar, which is if you had, for example, a merger of, let's say, the two hospitals in the area to one, workers still have no exit option. They have no opportunity to go to another hospital. So the fact that they have union representation might help them, but still their ability to bargain is limited by the absence of an exit option.
Yeah, I think the economics of the problem is fairly straightforward in the sense of, we have many frameworks to think about negotiations and bargaining. And we have to forecast potentially how their outside options change and how their threat points change. But I'm curious to see how the courts interpret this in the sense that we view this as an institution, or perhaps the rules of the game. And in the product markets, when firms merge, it's not like we're modeling the response of the trade association or the other institutions that would affect the product market. So, I mean, in some sense, if you're paralleling what the product markets did, maybe we should take the institutions as given and not forecast, well, when Kroger and Albertsons merge, do the two unions merge? How do their outside options change? Rather, we take the institution as given and model, ceteris paribus, what would happen to wages. So, I mean, I'm also curious to see how this plays out.
So Eric, I think you've mentioned a couple of times sort of the non-monetary costs of and harm to workers in mergers, but how do we actually value that?
Right. So this is an important and difficult problem. There are estimates. So you think like on the product market side, you buy, let's say, an automobile and you like it, and the concern is if two automobile companies merge, they might raise prices, which harms consumers, but they might also degrade the quality of the car. Maybe they'll keep the price the same, but spend less money building the car, so the car is less reliable. And from a consumer's perspective, maybe those two things are equally bad. And traditionally, the analysis of the agencies just focuses on prices and not on quality, and that worries people. So on the job market side, the problem is actually more serious because the empirical work that's been done suggests that the non-monetary component of a worker's compensation is very significant. So if you think of jobs that you've had and you've been liked or you didn't like, part of what you care about obviously is your wage, your monetary compensation. But there are all kinds of things that could matter to you. What your colleagues are like, how conveniently the work site is located, so the distance, your commuting time, whether there's a cafeteria, whether the food is good, whether the temperature is good, whether the conditions are comfortable, the quality of work that you're given, the amount of training you get. So there are all these aspects of work that are extremely important to people. And the analogous concern here is that if a merger takes place, maybe the new firm will not reduce wages. Maybe wages will continue to go up, but what the firm will do is reduce the quality of the work. And you actually hear anecdotally a lot of complaints about this. So after hospitals merge, you often hear from nurses and doctors that the quality of their work has declined. Now, not clear what you can do about this. It may be that one can estimate the value of these amenities for people by looking at how they behave. This is something Kyle can talk about, and then put that as part of your analysis. So you might say the workers are being paid $50,000 a year, but when you take into account the amenities, they're actually being paid effectively $60,000 a year, and we should use that as our figure when we're doing our merger analysis. But I think because of data limitations, that's very difficult to do.
Yeah, I think there's two separate issues here. One is, can we value the non-monetary benefits associated with the job? And I think there's a bunch of methods to do that. Revealed preference or A/B test, where I hand you a menu of jobs with different characteristics, and I ask you, okay, which of these jobs you prefer? Simply even rank those jobs allows you to put bounds on those values of amenities. And you can do that with, very small surveys, like the New York Fed Survey of Consumer Expectations runs modules like that, where they pan households these menus of options. But how that changes after a merger, there's just not a lot of research on that. And you have these very specific examples with hospitals, and you also have stuff in the private equity literature where you look at private equity buying a hospital, what happens to deaths, for instance. But outside of that, in the labor market, there's just not systematic research of how that changes after a merger. But I think we have methods of measuring it. They are expensive. It's hard to get a panel around a merger, but it's possible.
So we talked also about concentration thresholds when analyzing a merger, and an HHI above 1,800 is considered highly concentrated and will be subject to antitrust scrutiny. But conceptually, in terms of looking specifically at labor markets, why should the concentration threshold be lower? And I think that was in your presentation, Eric, actually.
Well, yes, I said it should be lower, but it's actually Kyle who's the expert on this, right?
Both of you should answer.
So, all right, so let me just start with like the overall concern, which is the switching costs concern. So, suppose that you use a certain grocery store regularly to buy your food, and over time you begin to notice prices are going up, the quality of the produce is going down, and so forth. Maybe you can very easily just switch to another grocery store in the neighborhood. And you don't feel any loyalty to your first grocery store. It's just you're pretty much indifferent between the two. And that's really what disciplines the stores, the worry that they're going to lose customers to their competitors. Jobs are just not like this, and I think, this is I think sinking in. I don't know, Kyle, correct me if I'm being unfair. I think many economists assumed that jobs were like this in the past, but it's become very clear that they're not. If you work for, let's say, a law firm or an accounting firm, or for a particular university, or if you work, for any kind of job, you get to know your colleagues. It matters to you that they're your colleagues. Maybe you're friendly with them. So if your conditions begin to degrade, your wages begin to go down, it might be more difficult for you to switch to another place because you lose your friends, or to move to another part of the country because you have a family. So that's the nature of the difficulty involved here.
I think that was a good response.
Excellent. Thank you, Kyle. First time you've said that.
I'm thinking back now of the map that you put up, where you might have 1, 2, or 3 major employers in, a region or city across the United States, tending to demonstrate that labor markets are local, regional. But what we saw with the COVID pandemic was now we can work remotely. We can be, maybe we have more of a national labor market because remote work is something new. We can work, we read the news about people, I'm gonna go to the Caribbean and I'm gonna work from there. So as remote work became more of the norm, and provided greater flexibility for worker mobility and wage potential, how do we factor that into this particular analysis that we're doing on it?
Sure.
So I think this really depends on the industry, and I think many industries you have the potential to work fully remote. Accountants being sort of the prime example. In many other industries, like in the Kroger Albertsons case, grocery store workers and manual workers in general, it's simply impossible to work remote. I think the work from remote trend has sort of reversed itself in the last year and a half. There has been a market rise. So, Nick Bloom and Steve Davis conduct this survey on work from home. And, you have about 7% of folks working fully remote before the pandemic, and it's increased to about 14% now, so it's doubled, but it's still the exception, not the norm. And it's not showing up in the labor market fluidity numbers. So the quit rate in JOLTS historically was around 2% per month. It spiked actually coming out of COVID. It looked like that story would maybe hold ground. It went up to about 3%, so that's a 50% increase in the quit rate, but then it's come right back down. And I think the company is demanding firms to be in the office 2 or 3 times a week. While partial remote work has gone through the roof, full-time remote work is still the exception. So I think, market by market, when courts look at mergers, they're going to have to take this into account. I think more broadly, just in terms of, did this raise labor market fluidity in a market way in the United States? It's not showing up in the official statistics yet.
Well, I think there's an Instagram meme about this, though, how the progress of remote work is diminished.
Yeah, I had this experience recently. I need to buy a new car, and I just emailed the guy I bought my previous car from 11 years ago, and he emailed me back. He said, "Thanks for thinking of me. Yeah, you can go in and test drive the latest model of your car." And I come in, and let's call this guy Joe. I come in assuming I was going to meet Joe, and this other person says, "I'm going to take you on your test drive." I said, "Where's Joe?" And he said, "Oh, Joe works from home." And I thought, I mean, do I want to buy a car from a guy who's like over the internet or, I didn't actually end up buying that car. And I think, it just seemed a little odd to buy a car from someone who wasn't there. I actually still need to buy a car. So I think there are limits to the remote work trend, Stacey.
All right. Well, I think I've exhausted my questions, so it's time for audience questions. Go ahead.
Then add a second way block or fix the other one. And so basically it's more red lights. It's just changing the rules to block more mergers. And it gives two chances to make a mistake, right? It may be good for these things to go through, but okay, we can make a mistake on either side and block them. So are there any other decisions we want to change along the way? So for example, we have the Hart-Scott-Rodino filing is a limit to say, well, if your size of the merger is below this, we ignore. Since, with this idea to now put two sides, which I think, by the way, will be a good employment act for labor economists, right? Because now you have to have IO people as well as labor economists. But should we be increasing the filing, the levels that we can just let some of the smaller ones alone? Or maybe we should be lowering it because there's all these little small businesses and small areas that we now have to start blocking if we start working on the labor market side.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't, right. So just first by way of background, I mean, this has always been the rule. It just hasn't been applied to labor markets. So as I mentioned, if you have two chain stores merging and there are like 1,000 local product markets, the merger has to not substantially lessen competition in any of them. As a practical matter, there can be divestments to address this problem, but you could, a single firm might sell into 100 different product markets. A conglomerate, for example. And so this has always been the rule that if there's competition goes down substantially in any particular market, we block it. Now, the rule is very much a crude prophylactic rule, like a speed limit. And there's always been this question of whether it's calibrated sufficiently. But if there's underlying harm that you're worried about, you obviously want the rule to capture it. So if there's labor market harm that's taking place, you want to block the merger. And if there isn't, you want to allow it to go through. Now, you mentioned the Hart-Scott-Rodino. So these are these rules that firms above a certain size, like $100 million in revenues, have to go to the Justice Department and disclose their plan to merge. And an economist, is it Thomas Woolman? I think that's his name, in Chicago, looked at what kinds of what do firms do if they are just below the Hart-Scott-Rodino threshold? And it turns out there are a ton of mergers right below the Hart-Scott-Rodino threshold that result in much higher prices. So you can imagine, like, there's this arbitrage going on. It'd probably make a lot of sense to lower the Hart-Scott-Rodino threshold, not because we just want to stop all mergers, because there's good reason to think that the threshold is set too high. It's like having a speed limit that's too low. And so what we should be driven here is not by some abstract concern about too many mergers or too few mergers, but how much harm is the result of the mergers that do take place.
Yeah, we're just saying, I mean, I've been influenced by your work, Tom, and work of Jim Schmitz in the idea that, the efficiency gains are significant. These mergers just hard to find in the data. So, I mean, is it a bad thing to have more red lights? I mean, we typically view competition and productivity gains go hand in hand. Coming from the trade literature, I think that's almost written on the wall. So, I mean, I imagine it's not going to increase the number of cases that the DOJ FTC take, but increase the success rate. And yeah, I mean, you look at Lonergan and Pierce, you look at cutting edge methods in census data, Levinson, Petrin, I don't know if Emil's here to measure productivity gains after a merger. It's hard to find them.
I was intrigued about one question. You talk about the markets. And one of the things I have found over the recent years is that employers are constrained by the supply of workers. And that's an issue why a lot of communities have been growing significantly, let's say Austin, Texas, for example, because it is difficult to identify sort of good workers. And some of these old company towns, so to speak, end up withering, not so much because even though they have a lot of power, the firms, in terms of controlling, quote unquote, the wages, they just are not able to continue to get the supply of workers. Could you just sort of comment on that topic? Because it seems to me that that should be a factor whether these mergers occurred in sort of company in markets where there is really wealth like New York, Chicago, LA, et cetera.
Well, yeah, so geographic mobility in the United States has been plummeting. And, even after COVID, it upticked, but not by a significant amount. I think this is an important factor in measuring monopsony powers. How mobile are workers? How easy is it for them to move across geographies? And, Eric mentioned this in his talk today at the university, but there's, many methods of measuring market power, and in labor markets, the obvious one is job flows, right? We talk about Herfindahl's and concentration, but using actual mobility rates to define notions of monopsony seems like a reasonable thing to do.
So I'm a big fan of increased competition. So I'm a big fan of what Kyle is really pushing for. Prohibit them all. Just don't allow any of it. That's fine. But let me play devil's advocate for a minute. I think we're being a little bit too quick in the switching cost analysis of the difference between product and labor markets. Two issues that I think ought to be taken seriously. If you're talking about switching toothpastes, right? Those have low switching costs relative to the price of toothpaste. When it comes to jobs, however, what matters, I suspect, in the analysis is the proportion of the switching costs relative to the price or the wage. And so we should be careful to make sure that we scale appropriately. The second thing, which is very relevant, is that labor market relationships, especially for relatively well-compensated professionals like registered nurses or doctors and so on, are much more individualized than the analysis suggests. Long-term contracts are much more prevalent. The reputational effects of reducing amenities when you're the only employer are also significant when it comes to these kinds of workers. And so therefore, the allegation that, oh yeah, two hospitals are going to merge and we're going to make life miserable for doctors, and no doctors anywhere are ever going to find out about it. What world are we living in? Let's be serious about this. So I'm all in favor of treating labor markets with a lot of seriousness, but it cannot be done on the basis that, oh, it's obvious that switching costs are higher for labor than for groceries, nor can it be on the basis that those high switching costs mean that employers have an extraordinary amount of market power. Both as director of HHEI and previously as chair of the department, I've had to hire people. Trust me, this market does not seem like a monopsony to me. The people I tried to hire were very aware of what benefits the University of Minnesota offers, what the compensation was. And so therefore, it was a bargaining process, not that different from that happens when you buy a car, right? And so taking into account the fact that these markets are much more individualized, and the fact that firms who mistreat their workers, especially relatively highly compensated workers, suffer significant reputational losses, are all things that I think serious economic analysis should undertake. But at the end of the day, let's ban them all.
So let me, I actually do think it's obvious, as a lawyer, not an economist. I'll let Kyle talk about the data if there are any. But this has been a topic of labor economics for decades. And I just want to appeal to people's intuitions, because I'm sure everybody here has had a job, including students. And if you're on a job, you're working 8 hours a day or more. And if you're thinking about another job, you have to take time out from the job that you're working 8 hours a day on, interview with people, maybe travel to another part of the country. You have to worry about the impact of leaving your job, to interview people on, what your employer thinks about you in case you don't get another job. And then, as you point out, jobs are highly differentiated. So it's not that easy to figure out what another job is really like. So even for an academic, every economics department or law school is different. You have to understand the differences. It's very common in law, my field, where it's a kind of a quasi requirement for a professor to spend a whole semester at another law school so that those people can find out what the professor is like and the professor can find out what the law school is like. That's a huge cost, especially if you have a working spouse and kids and others and you're commuting back and forth. But even for, more commodified jobs, if you're working, 8-hour shift at McDonald's, when are you going to interview at your other job? You're going to have to take time off to do that. So I think switching costs are actually very significant in labor markets. There are some product markets where switching costs are very high. Platforms are the big example, but they're relatively unusual. But your second question, I also disagree about that. So you say long-term contracts, and I understand you're using that more in an economic sense. Legally, it's very, very rare for workers to have long-term contracts. Like the norm is contract at will. So it's not your setting where you're hiring a tenured professor who you can't get rid of. Employers can fire workers at any time they want, for any reason or no reason. And so an employer actually cannot make a credible commitment. They don't want to, this is a complicated issue. They don't want to, and they won't make a credible commitment to a worker that we're never going to degrade your working conditions for as long as you're here, which could be 10, 20, 30 years. That just doesn't happen. Now, you say that employers are concerned about their reputation for quality. That's possible. And that's something that we should think carefully about. The anecdotal evidence that I've been given about doctors and nurses is that they are extremely angry about how their working conditions have changed. Now, this might not have to do with labor market power. It might reflect other things that are going on. But I don't think it's the case that that they get commitments that they're going to have a certain amount of autonomy going into the future. They're basically just guessing, and their only remedy is if the employer mistreats them is to leave.
So on the data front, there's great work in Econometrica by Kennan and Walker, who estimate moving costs in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it eludes me the fraction of the wage that those moving costs comprise, but they must be significant in that we're seeing large declines in mobility rates across US markets. I think the idea that we should model the dynamics is important. And I think for many reasons, and I'll plug some of my students' work, William Youngerman working on the dynamics of monopsony. It's important for reputation concerns. It's also important for measurement that if we see a low wage today, but that's just reflecting training or human capital accumulation, that's not monopsony. And so I think making this push in the economic modeling to incorporate dynamics is going to be important for the way that we measure and regulate monopsony.
I think we have to cut it there. Thank you very much for joining us here today, Eric, Kyle, and Stacy. This was a very interesting event. I certainly learned a lot. And I encourage everyone to join us at outside in the hall. There is a reception there. We can continue the interesting debate.
Very far anyway.